Margaret to Cathaoirleach. Look, I think a lot has been discussed about this issue, not because we've had plenty of time to actually discuss your bill, but because we've been kicking back and saying we're not willing to forgo pre-legislative scrutiny and that we don't have enough time to actually discuss the details of this. And I think, Minister, this is setting, particularly for the Green Party, a really, really bad precedent. At the first sign of the crisis, you've effectively abandoned the minimal safeguards in relation to planning and development, and indeed in relation to climate action, stuff that's already on the statute books. And this Act sets aside the environmental impact assessment and several directives in order to fast-track these developments, to facilitate gas-fired generators to be ready next winter, because we are told we will face great threats to our power supply if we don't move fast. And every reason under the sun is given for that potential outcome. Every reason, from Ukraine to we failed to generate enough offshore wind, there's a lot more people coming on the grid, etc., etc. But the obvious one, the very, very obvious one, is being ignored. Now, if we park for a minute, because it's a bigger, longer debate, the obvious question as to how this wonderful market system in the supply of electricity was to usher in a new and great era of competitive energy and leave us all lana with energy with low prices, etc., utterly failed. That neoliberal model that was brought in the early 2000s utterly failed. Not only are people faced with massive bills, but they're also now being told, and we've just heard the evidence from the Cork deputy, that they may be facing blackouts unless we ignore all the environment legislation, all the climate legislation that has gone heretofore. So you're asking a tall order here of us deputies to pass this, and I can tell you, People Before Profit will not be supporting this bill. We will call a vote against it. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because what I really hate more than anything else is the idea that you think that we're stupid, that we're idiots, that we'll swallow the diatribe of Ukraine and shortage of supply for the reality, which is that data centres are gobbling up something like 15 to 17% of the power on our national grid now. And the absolute outrageous scandal that we are a total outlier, not just in Europe but on the planet, in terms of how we deal with the national grid and the facilitation of data centres. We're putting it aside because we are told that this is most important to our economy. Without the multinationals, we'd all drop down dead. Without the multinationals having their data centres, they'd flee the country. So this big hammer is held over political opposition and over the people of Ireland as if there is no alternative in this world but to facilitate Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, all of the big giant multinationals, and they are all based here in their head office because they get a low tax regime. And now we are facilitating them to the hilt with whatever amount of data centres they want. Now, you said earlier on in your speech, I wasn't in the chamber but I was listening, that we discovered somehow in 2021 that we were going to run into trouble in the winter of 23. And so now in 22 we're having to pass this emergency legislation. Well, I'll tell you what I think happened. I think in 2021 we discovered that there was going to be a problem. And Eamon Ryan, the Minister, and yourselves sat down and you did what you always do. You think, in my mind, and he always says this, in my mind, what needs to be done is this, this and this. And you went to your top civil servants and they went blah, 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 like Greta Thunberg expressed many times about COP. But I've seen it in action in the Climate Committee. The amount of blah, blah, blah when it comes to dealing with reality is astonishing. And they blah, blah just to death. And you got to 2022 and you realised, Jesus Christ, we now have 8 mega data centres to be connected to the grid, which already had the planning permission, which weren't part of the moratorium that we insisted on, and they are going to gobble up 1.5 gigawatts of energy. Never mind the 450 megawatts that you're buying in. And this has all been documented in parliamentary questions which we've asked and evidence which we've got back. And even Crew have said to us despite what we're being told at those committees, that actually Ireland isn't an outlier, and that growth of 9% in demand for energy is not unusual. And Crew come back to us and they tell us it's absolutely unusual, that there is no other country in Europe that has had growth of 9% in energy demand in the last 5 years. That's what we've had. And we've had it because of the growth in data centres. All of the other big economies in Europe, all 26 of them or whatever it is, I always get mixed up with the number, have had zero growth in energy demand, particularly when you include in the 2 years of the COVID crisis. We are an outlier. And we are an outlier for reasons, and now we are passing legislation that flies in the face of environmental and climate concerns in order to facilitate giant multinationals at an obscene level. And it isn't just about energy, it's also about water. So it is unusual. It's extraordinary, in fact, and it's most extraordinary to see that this is being done under the guidance of the Green Party, who got into power to say that we're going to be the saviours of the environment and we'll drive a green agenda. And yes, you got your carbon laws passed, but now you're unwinding them bit by bit in order to facilitate the economic powers that drive decisions in this country. So we're tearing up the Planning and Development Act because we want to bring in a clause that will lift the constraints that may be imposed on these data centres. Now, we're bringing in a few amendments to this, and I've no doubt that they will probably be rejected by the Minister. I've no doubt that if they aren't rejected, there are other elements in this House that will vote against them. But I'm telling you now, Minister, this is a charade. And it's a charade mainly because you're treating us like we're ticks, like we don't see the reality of what is coming down the tracks. It is nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. We do not get supplied gas from Russia. We get our gas from Norway, from the North Sea, across Moffat and from Corrib. We are not under threat of gas shortage because of the reasons that you gave in your speech, or that are continually spewed out to us, with passion, by the way, from government ministers and particularly from the Minister for the Environment, Eamon Ryan. So this is not good enough. Despite all of the arguments we have made, all of the attempts to pass bills, motions by ourselves and others to ban the proliferation of data centres in this country, we are continuing with the same old policy. And mark the words of those who've predicted it, the scientists and even the data centre industry themselves, by 2030, which is a big cut-off date for what's going to happen in terms of climate mitigation. Everything is 2030, 1 million EV cars by 2030, reduction of emissions by 35 to 40% by 2030, cutting the herd by 20. Everything's mañana, the next government, the next part of the climate plan. Kick it down the road, kick for touch. But by 2030, we keep going down this road, data centres will be consuming not 15, not 17% of our national grid, but 30%. And then you think you're going to have to fool the people to say, oh, Janie Mac, we need more backup generation. We're going to have to change the laws again and again. We're going to have to ignore environmental impact statements. We're going to have to ignore our climate targets. We're going to have to go back on everything we said and continue our reliance on fossil fuels, not because we're not good enough at renewables, not because people aren't playing their part, not because you've imposed a carbon tax on them, but because you're craving and bowing down to and can't do enough for throwing out the red carpet to multinational corporations who really don't give a damn and who aren't playing their part because they're not paying the proper taxes in this country, but you'll do anything to bend over backwards to facilitate them in this pithy little republic. No other country in the world does it, but we happen to manage to do it. So absolutely, totally opposed to, albeit we attempt to amend this bill, we are totally opposed to this passing.